You're listening to the Decidedly podcast. The following conversation contains explicit language and topics of a mature nature. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
All right, so having this discussion today, preparing for this podcast, I think was one of our more challenging, when you say, Sanger, was one of the more challenging preparatory work that we had to do, because we had to figure out how are we going to talk to Dr. Celeste Holbrook, who's a sex educator, sex expert, but I wasn't really wanting to talk to her about sex.
Yeah, well, you know, every boy just loves to chat about sex with his dad. So
there's nothing.
I was really
there's nothing more comfortable than that, right?
It's so natural for us.
I was struggling coming up with questions to ask her that weren't sex questions, that were decision-making questions. So the conversation really took an interesting turn. You know, when she started talking about her faith-based framework on decision-making and how that changed her outlook on sex, going from a purity culture starting point and then getting married and having, as she says, penetrative sex for the first time on her wedding night and having that not go the way she wanted, causing that decision point to move her into now where she is, you know, focusing on giving sex classes and being a sex expert.
Yeah, this one, you know, it didn't seem like it on the face before we started recording that we'd get a lot of decision-making material out of this, but I think this was probably one of our best conversations when it comes to really actually learning something about decision-making.
Yeah, I agree.
We talked about so much. We talked about sex, we talked about money, we talked about the Bible. We really covered it all and got a lot of knowledge on how to make better decisions because of it.
So listen up to our discussion with Dr. Celeste Holbrook. What's the most popular class?
The blowjob class is pretty popular. We have a basic blowjob class, and we teach all of them online now. So that makes it even easier. So you can just show up.
What's the age?
That's a good question. As far as when we were in the in-house classes, I would say 25 to 50-ish range, a big range. Typically more people in longer term relationships, I would say, for a lot of the classes. Maybe BDSM kink class gets a little lower age range, but yeah, it's a pretty large range.
I would think the BDSM class would be mostly couples, as opposed to, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
in that class, the blowjob class, about half people are single.
Mm-hmm.
I would think the BDSM would be mostly couples.
Probably so. Or people who are partnered but watching on their own. Yeah.
What's the biggest issue you deal with in the BDSM class? I have a sense of what the blowjob class is about.
Yeah.
What are you covering in BDSM class?
Yeah. So the BDSM class is a basics class. And so it really is learning the basics of, bondage, submission, dominance, sadomasochism. And so a lot of people, I think, attend the class thinking like, we're going to get the whips and chains and the floggers out, and I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this. And although we do talk about that some, like there's a lot of groundwork that you have to lay before you can consensually restrain somebody or consensually inflict wanted pain. Right. There's a lot that you have to know, including safe words, including what we call RAC, is risk aware consensual kink. So knowing what the risks are. For example, it's not just there's a risk of being hurt. There's a risk of being embarrassed, or there's a risk that I don't actually like this, or there's a risk that I like it for a time and then I don't like it. So you have to really know all of the risks before you go into a kink or BDSM situation. So there's a lot of groundwork to lay, like understanding your safe word, understanding the risk. What about aftercare? What if somebody's like, I'm tapping out, my safe word's giraffe, I'm out, I don't want this anymore. What happens then? Like, do I want to be close to you? Do we want to be separate? Do we end sex altogether? Do we go take a shower? Like, having all of those things in place is really important to having a successful BDSM or dominance experience or sub experience. And I think that's what people don't maybe think about going into a BDSM class. Like, we're just going to talk about all the wild things.
What is there a risk in that, as you say, that there's this novel experiences increase sexual arousal? Is there a risk that you start going down the rabbit hole that you're like, okay, I've tried this, and now I need to do something more aggressive or more dangerous or novel, as you said, because the end game, I guess, potentially could be physical harm. Mm-hmm. Is there a risk that somebody gets too far down that road?
Sure, there's always risk, especially, because novelty is vulnerable. I'm being vulnerable and asking for something new that I want in sex. I'm being vulnerable and asking for something different in sex. So vulnerability always comes with an element of risk. And so that's why we lay it out kind of early. Like, what are we going to do? What are we going to not do? What are my hard limits? Like, fuck no. And what are my soft limits? Like, I'm not into this right now, but you can ask me later. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that before helps with that. But what I hear you saying is there like a rolling stone or rolling snowball that never ends? And I would like to say that sexuality is something that you can explore in novelty for the rest of your life. And I hope that people do. Like, that's what I hope that people do is.
But with anything, somebody's going to take it too far.
Well, I mean, my question really
some people weigh 500 pounds because they just love cheeseburgers. I mean, people are going to go to the extreme. There's always going to be somebody that went to the extreme.
Well, my question is, with something like that, do you find that people need an increasing degree of novelty or, I guess, pain or restraint or whatever that follows to get the arousal that they're seeking? It's this dopamine hit, right?
Response,
in other words,
sure.
if I take a drug and I get a hit, maybe I need to take a little bit more of that drug the next time to get the same reaction, because my baseline now is reset at a higher level. And that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I think it's good to be aware that novelty does fuel arousal, but it's not the only thing. And sometimes our sexual experiences are complex. So sometimes we want high levels of eroticism and wildness, and sometimes we want like intimacy and connection. And actually knowing somebody or being seen or known by somebody is what fosters intimacy and connection. So moving away from sex always needs to be wild and swinging from the chandeliers, or else I'm not getting that dopamine response, and moving more towards sex is a complex thing that sometimes I want one thing and sometimes I want another thing. And sex is always a co-creation of an experience by two individual people who are constantly changing. So novelty is actually kind of built in. Like, I'm not the same person I was last week. And so my sex life is probably not exactly the same as I was last week. And so novelty is always built in, and novelty is not the only fuel for arousal. It can be some of these other things, connection and intimacy and being known.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you get people or encourage couples to have those open discussions? Because it would seem like that is a necessary factor. Unlike other experiences, you've got to have these conversations. Mm-hmm. It's a must, where maybe it's preferred in other areas, and you can kind of feel your way through it. No pun intended.
No pun intended. We like all the sexual puns. It's okay.
How do you get couples to have those discussions?
Yeah. First is normalizing that sex is a skill that you have to learn, like riding a bike, and you learn it and you learn it and you learn it again, because we're always changing. So we're kind of sold this lie through porn and media in general, that if you're attractive enough or if you are in love enough, that sex will be natural and easy. And in reality, sex is a biologically natural thing that we do, but it is not easy per se or organic. It is a skill like eating. Eating is natural too, but we kind of have to learn how to do it. And so first of all, just level setting with couples, like, sex is a skill. You're here because you want sex to get better, and it's a skill that you have to work on. And then the next thing I always ask, and this is something that you can do with your partners, or your listeners can do with your partners, is I want you to write down my dream sexual experience would feel like, because whatever it is that you want to feel, you will work to do the behaviors that help you feel that. Like any behavior we do, I want to go ride my bike because I want to feel that dopamine from exercise. I want to pet my dog because I want to feel calm, right? So any behavior we do is based on what we want to feel. So writing down in my dream sexual experience, I want to feel pleasure, eroticism, connection, intimacy, right? Write down what you want to feel and have your partner write down what they want to feel, and then see some similarities, and then start to talk about, okay, what behaviors can we do to help feel those things that we want to feel? And you'll find that there's a lot of similarities between what people want to feel, but the behaviors they want to do to get there are sometimes different. And that's where the co-creation and negotiation of sex begins. But starting with like similar feelings is a really great way for everybody to feel seen and known and satisfied in sex.
How many of those feelings do you have people write down?
As many as they want.
Okay. It's not just, this is my one thing.
Yeah.
You don't boil it down to one. You sort of make a list.
Yeah, make a list.
And then just sort of compare, hey, we both wanted this in common.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you find that people are coming to you because they have problems that they want to resolve, or do you find that people primarily are coming to you because, hey, everything's fine, but we want to get better? Like, in other words, I'm an athlete, I want to get stronger and faster and better, or I'm an athlete and I'm injured and I need to fix something. What, you see what I mean? So restorative or improvement?
That's a really good question. I think a little bit of both. Most of the couples that come to me have a really strong foundation in their relationship. Like, our relationship is good. We know how to co-parent well. We know how to talk. We know how to deal with finances. We can manage all of these other things, but sex is like this elephant in the room that we can't seem to figure out. We can't seem to get on the right page. One has lower libido, one has higher libido. We're just having trouble in this area. So that's the majority of my couples are pretty strong relationally, but sexually have just never learned the skill sets for sexual negotiation. So I think that's a big part of my practice. A fairly other big part of my practice are more single people who want to establish their sexual ethic. Maybe they grew up in a conservative church system, or something that's holding them back from getting the sex life that they want, or being comfortable with their own body. Like, this is typically women, not always, but typically women. So there's like the 80s and 90s, we were in the evangelical church especially told that sex is for men, and that the women should cover up their bodies because men's minds are dangerous and women's bodies are dangerous, and so women's bodies are in charge of men's arousal. It's a very dysfunctional type of way to tell people to wait until you're married to have sex. And so when you grow up in that way, you as a woman kind of believe that sex is not for you, that not only is sex not for you, but you are in charge of another person's arousal by your body. And that leads to pretty dysfunctional feelings about sex and your body. And so it's not just like, I don't feel great in my body or body image. It is deeper than that.
Do you think that has been throughout time, or do you think that was just a period of time that we just came through? It seems like that has changed a lot in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, I think women as objects or sexual objects has always been, because men have always been in charge, and men have historically been the ones who write the narrative on sex. Like, if we think about even how we define sex as penis going into a vagina, probably defined by somebody who owned a penis, because we know that most clitoris owners have their first and most of their orgasms through clitoral stimulation and not vaginal stimulation. So defining sex even as penis going into vagina, as defining pleasurable sex as penis going to vagina, because we have 97% of our sex we have for pleasure, not for reproduction, is very male-centered. And so historically, yes, women have been on the lower end of having sexual agency, understanding their body, being encouraged to masturbate, things like that.
What do you think is changing that dynamic or that attitude? Because I've seen a shift in, and I'm in my mid 50s, so I've seen a marked shift in the dialogue around women's sexuality. I guess you could say in the 70s there was this ownership of women in control that came from the sort of advent of the pill, but now we're seeing more discussions about